Hi everyone, this is Martin with another video from our FEDSA mentoring sessions. This week we're going to be looking at destructuring objects and arrays, and it's week 7 of the year 2022. People tend to look at destructuring and they get like a little bit worried, but it's the principle behind it is actually quite basic, as you'll see in this video. And I hope this will be able to sort of demystify it so that you can begin using it in your code, as it makes your code a lot more concise. Right, just before we jump in, these sessions are sponsored by Code Capsules. They are a platform as a service, so you can actually go and host your website on them, and not just basic websites, some really complex stuff, your React apps, all of that. Highly recommend checking them out. And the coolest thing is that they're actually South African, so supporting locally. Another thing is that if you actually host your site there, I don't believe you're ever going to get a faster page load speed if you actually host on their services compared to one of the competitors. Anyways, let's jump into it. So what exactly is destructuring? Destructuring, which is formally called the destructuring assignment syntax, is a way for us to unpack values out of objects and arrays. So you don't use it on any other data types, it's just objects and arrays. You can see that we've actually got some examples here. We'll be looking at these in more detail, objects and arrays, and destructuring from them. But this is just sort of like a basic example for now so that you understand what we're going to be looking at in a moment. Okay, so this first example here is we can see we've got this person object, and it's got a first name key and a last name key with John and Doe. And then we actually destructure those to first name and last name. And then you can use these throughout your code base. Then over here, you can see we've got an array. We've got our first value and our second value. So it's index 0 and index 1. And then we destructure those to X and Y. Okay, so let's start looking at objects first. We'll be looking at objects first because that's usually where destructuring takes place. As mentioned, you can actually destructure from arrays, but you very seldomly see it happen. Whereas objects, it's happening all the time in JavaScript. Okay, so let's start with why we would actually want to destructure. So you've got an object here, person 1. Now, if we wanted to get all of these values out of person 1, we would start doing our normal assignments like this. We would go and say const id is equal to person 1 and then dot. And then you can see these values here because VS Code is being smart enough with IntelliSense to know that these keys belong to that object because we've created that object first. And I'm going to go and type id. Okay, so now id is actually going to be 0 as per what we've got up over here. So save it, and then you can see there's 0. Now we're going to need to also get first name, last name, and is admin. So imagine we need all of those in our code. So I'm going to go and grab first name here and get last name and is admin. So I'm just duplicating. And I think this is what I'm doing here is find with next match. Okay, so we're going to do last name and then we're going to do is admin. Now I'm just going to go and console log these as well. And then save. Okay, so you can see our values are here. We've got ID, which is 0. We've got first name, which is John. We've got last name, which is Doe. And then lastly, you've got is admin, which is a Boolean. And you can see that that is true. So we've got these values out of that object. Okay, so what you've got here works now. You know, you're learning JavaScript and, you know, you've finally getting these values out of your object. So you shout out to your partner or your dog or someone and you're like, check it out. Look what I can do here. So it's cool and everything. But it doesn't really scale well. If we were to go and have another 8 key value pairs added over here, key value being that this is the key and this is a value. So you consider it a key value pair. If we were to add like, I don't know, 8 more, maybe 100 more, we would have to go and have just as many lines of code added here. Another thing is that, what if I change this person 1 to person 2? Now suddenly these aren't going to work anymore. If I go and I save, you can see that person 1 is not defined because this doesn't exist anymore, this person 1, because I've changed it to a 2. So what you would have to do then is you need to go in here and you need to change it to 2. Sorry, you need to go change it to a 2 and change that to a 2. Realistically, that actually wouldn't happen. And I'll tell you why, actually. We're going to just go off the path here for a moment. If you actually did really want to change a variable, you could actually just push the F2 key, right? So you can actually see it there, and I can go and change person 2. You know, so there are actually quicker ways to do it. But, you know, the point still remains that you'd have to go and change all of these values around. Okay, so it just doesn't scale. There has to be a better way that we can actually do this. So I've changed the values back to person 1. And let's now take a look at destructuring and how it can make our lives a lot easier. Okay, so what I'm just going to start with is just commenting out this code. I don't want to delete it just so that we can actually reference it. So it's going to still be there at the bottom, but then we're going to start working over here. Okay, so the first thing we do is we write the const keyword. Then after that, we go and put 2 curly braces, or an opening curly brace and a closing curly brace. If you're using an array, as you'll see a bit later, we would have the square brackets, but because it's an object, we can have curly braces. And what this is basically a box that we unpack the variables into, which can then be used in our code. Okay, so we've got our box here. Then after that, we need to assign it to an object. Okay, so in this case, we want to use the person object. So that means we want to get the key value pairs out of this person object. All right, so we write person1, and that's it. Okay, so that's basically it. That's it done. Like there's no more further sort of syntax needed. This is how you actually destructure. Now, what I can do inside here, if I push Control spacebar, and I think on Mac it's Command spacebar, you can see all of the key value pairs that are over here. So I can go and get ID, I can get first name, I can get last name, and I can get is admin. Okay, so now this is destructuring all of these values from this object. So let's just go and I'm just going to take this console log, just reuse it so it's exactly the same as what we had earlier. And there you go. You can actually see that our values are destructured. Okay, so looking at it now, can you see that we first had 4 lines of code over here? And now we've actually got it on just 1 line of code. You know, it's that simple. If we want to go and change this to person 2, we're just going to have to, we just change it in one place, right? And you don't have to actually go and take every single value out of here. You can only, if say we only wanted the first name and the last name, and we didn't really care about the other things, we'll have to just delete this because we don't have ID anymore. It's going to have an error. So let me just save and show you. So we don't have an ID because we took it out, and we don't have is admin. Okay, so saved. Okay, so you can see that we have destructured these values with like first name is corresponding with first name from here, and last name is corresponding with last name from the object. And this is now a variable we can use throughout our code. You know, so if you maybe had like data come through as an APR and you just wanted to grab first name and last name out of 100 different properties, this is an easy way to go and do it. And now you can just use it throughout your code. Okay, so that's really just the basics of it. It's really just that simple. So I think what we should do now is I'm going to delete this here. We don't need this code anymore. And let's just quickly do another example to sort of try and you know, further strengthen this foundation. So what I'll do is I'll just call it const dog. Actually, let's just call it pet. Okay, so I'll make it like a pet object here. And the name will be, let's just do Jasper. Type, which is a dog. And age, let's make it 6. And is Smelly, and that's certainly true. Okay, so let's now get these values out of this object. Okay, so when I went and did it first time around, you saw that I first went and actually created the brackets like that, and then I assigned it to the object we're going to use before going and writing all of these values here. And the reason I'm doing that is so that we can get code completion, or the IntelliSense can kick in, and then when I push Control Spacebar, it's going to know that all these values are available. If I hadn't written out pet yet, so let's just say I went like this, and then I wanted to start getting these values, there's no way for VS Code to know that I'm going to be referring to this object in the future. You know, am I going to be referring to pet, or am I going to be referring to person 1? It's not going to know. So we do have to assign it this pet. So now it knows, okay, I'm going to look at this pet object and see what keys there are, and then I'm going to cleverly suggest it to you. Okay, so now you can see these values are there. But what you could have done, though, is you could have gone and said, you know, name, type, age is Smelly, and then equal to pet. It's just more prone to errors if you are doing it that way. You know, I might have thought that it's first name, But yeah, so what I highly recommend is that when you are going to go and try and destructure is to first do the brackets like that. Then you can go and then you can actually have a look at IntelliSense and actually see what there actually is there. Okay, so let's just actually grab the stuff here, top, age, smelly, and let's console log this. Just going to copy paste that. Save it. Okay, so you can see we're actually getting the values there. Right, so can you see that we're just basically unpacking these variables into our... Sorry, we're just unpacking it into this, like, what basically is a box, and then we can actually use these values throughout our code. Now, I'd like to take a look at some other things you can do when destructuring to like more, I'm going to say advanced features, but it's sort of like additional things that you can be doing. Right, and the first one I'm going to be looking at is changing the name of the variable that's coming out. So we've got first name and we've got last name. But now, what if we actually wanted these to be called different variable names? So let's say a project manager, whoever's gone and told us that we need it to be username. So let's just say const username is equal to first name. And now we can console log username. Okay, so first name is now a variable username, and now we're using, let's just say we're using username throughout our code base. But as you can see, this is not very concise. It's like it doesn't feel very clean. So what you can instead do is put a colon after the variable and then give it a new variable name. Okay, so I'm going to delete this line of code and I'm going to save. And you're going to see that we're not going to have errors or anything, and John is actually still coming through. So as you can see, we've got a colon and we've actually assigned this first name as username. So I guess let's just do last name as end name. And that's just purely for example. So let's console log end name and save it. And then you can see that we've got John Doe. So this might not feel like very practical. So I think what we should do now is maybe just have a look at just very quickly look at a practical example here. And I am sort of winging this. I'm sorry if it doesn't work out first time around. What I'm going to do is create a function called modify person. Okay, and what it's going to do is it's going to be just a function that we pass in a person object. Okay, so then I'll call modify person and I'll pass in my person one. Okay, and I'll save it. And then you're going to see that when we pass in person one as an argument, then this is now the parameter, and we console log that parameter, we can see that we're getting these values out of here. Now, what we could have done, let's say we wanted person, we want to console log person.first name, and we want to console log person.last name, and save it. Now we've got John and Doe. Now we're back to when we very first started. If you can remember where we had sort of this longer way of doing things, we can then actually destructure right here as our parameter. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write first name. I'm going to write last name. Okay, and I'm just going to delete that. And let's save. And there you go. So now we've actually destructured these key value pairs from the variable, sorry, the parameter that comes in, which is an object. Okay, so that's where you can see it gets sort of really, really concise. And you'll see this very often being done in React, for example, where there's often an object getting passed called props. You'll see it very, very commonly in React. And then also this, remember we had this example here, we've got this username. So what we can do is just make the username, sorry, I should actually just take this out here. Save it. And I'll change this to username. I'm just going to delete this other line here. And then when I save it, you can see that we've actually got John coming through. Okay, very cool. Right. So the next thing we're going to be looking at is the REST syntax. And it works in both the objects and arrays. And basically what it is three dots like this, dot, 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 and then a variable name. So over here, we've got first name, last name. And then we've actually still got ID and isAdmin still in this object. Okay, so what we can actually do is we can say right at the end here, we can go dot, 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 and I'm just going to type rest, but it can be anything. It can be remainder, left over, anything of the sort. And now if you look, when we console log rest, it's going to be basically that we've unpacked this first name, and we've unpacked last name. So we've unpacked first name and we've unpacked last name. So what's left over is ID and is admin, and that can be handled with this ... rest syntax. So if you see, when we actually console log rest, there you can see we've just got ID and we've just got is admin. This can be very, very useful where, for example, like in that function we had earlier where we're passing in an object, then we extract some other things out of it, but then we maybe call another function with whatever is left over from that object. So there are some use cases for this, also in arrays especially, that there can be use cases for this. And it's definitely something to be aware of. You will be seeing this around, just not very common. And as I said earlier, it doesn't have to be called rest. You could call this leftover if you want. Call it whatever you want. What is important is the 3 dots. That these ellipses, these are actually sort of the rest syntax that is important. So if I save here, you'll see that leftover does show. The next thing I want to look at is default values. These values that come through over here might actually be undefined. And then what do we actually do in that case? So what we can actually do when we are destructuring is we can actually go and set a default value. And the way you do that is you put the equal sign and then whatever you want your default value to be. So I'll say, let's just call this no last name. So it's you can easily identify it. And what I'll do here is console log first name and then last name. Okay, and save it. Now we've got John Doe coming through because we do actually have a last name here. But now what I'm going to do is I'm going to comment this out. So it doesn't exist anymore. So this is going to kick in because we don't have a last name property anymore. So let's save. And there you can see it. We've got John and then no last name. Okay, so this is how you can go and handle default values. Remember in our function example, this is where this is really, really great, because your person passes in an object into your function and a value might not exist, so maybe they don't have an ID or something, and this lets you go and set that. So I guess let me just go and show you that very quickly, how it would look. Okay, so I've very quickly gone and created a very similar function to what we had earlier. So let's go and call this modify person, and let's just add person1 to it. So we're calling the function modify person, this function here, and we're passing in this person object. And we've destructured, I'm just going to take this out. We've destructured first name from the object, from this person object, and we've also destructured last name. And if there is no last name, we're going to say no last name, right? And then we console log the first name and the last name. So let's save it. And then you can see it, John, no last name. But if I was to go and put last name back and save it, it now becomes John Doe. So that's a great fallback in case maybe a value isn't actually populated. Now, usually when you're destructuring, it's fairly simple. As you saw, like we would just say const ID is equal to person. And now I've just gone and grabbed ID just out of person. Sorry, person1. Let's just console log that. But sometimes you're going to have nested objects and maybe even nested objects. And that is where even for people that have been doing this for a while, it can catch them out, myself included. It can catch you out, and you will find these gurus out there that are the kings and queens of destructuring. And it gets so complex. It's quite an art. It's like regex where you sort of, there's just people that really just get it. So let's have a look at that, where it does actually get a little bit more complex. So what I've got here is I've added an object inside of this object. So we've got person1, then we've got .country, and then there's also a .code and a .currency. Okay, so let's say we actually wanted to get country out of here, but now we don't just want country. So right now, when I've actually done this, it's going to give us this whole object. Okay, so I'm actually going to take this ID out, and I'm just going to write country. Okay, so you can see that we've got code, ZA, and currency symbol R, but that we actually wanted these values, your team lead or whatever, they're like, we actually wanted the currency symbol. I don't want you to have to go and write dot again, that's defeating the point of destructuring. Okay, so what you need to do is you need to destructure country, and then you need to destructure code out of country. So the way you do that is try and ignore what's going on the outside here, and basically think of that you're destructuring it again in another object. So yeah, we first had this outside box over here. Now we've got this inside box, and unfortunately, that's actually doing bracket coloring. If you can't see it, this one is yellow, and then this one is like a pink or magenta. So what you do now is you can write code and currency symbol. Okay, so when I actually now console log this, and I save, there you'll see we've actually got ZA and we've got R. Sorry, I've got an auto formatter on here, so let me actually just take that out so you can see it in one line. Might make a bit more sense. So you can see that we are first destructuring that person where we can grab this country object, right? Then try and think of it as like destructuring inception, where we now have this where we are destructuring from this country object. So it's almost like we were actually saying, just bear with me. It's almost like we're actually saying const code currency symbols equal to country of person. If you get what I'm trying to indicate here. So this isn't going to work, but as an example here, this is sort of what we're trying to do. So just try and think of it as that we've got this outside one that we've destructured from person. Then on the inside, we are destructuring once again. Right, so that's generally how you would handle these complex ones. I guess let's go even further than this. Let's change currency to be its own object. And inside, we're going to have currency code. Sorry. Okay, we'll have currency code, and let's just do dollar value. Throw it at like 18. Okay, so now we've actually got a person, which has got a country object inside of it. Then in that country object, we've got a currency. And then inside of that currency object, we've got currency code and currency dollar. Okay, so this code isn't going to work here. So what we need to do now is destructure this further. We're going to go and write currency. And then inside of this is where we can go and destructure currency code and dollar value. Okay, so let's just got to take this currency code and dollar value. Okay, we save it. Okay, so there you can see we're actually getting R and we're getting 18. Okay, so now that I've showed you that, if this is like, whoa, man, you need to slow down, don't worry about it. This is like crazy, even for many developers. Like, this can really catch you out. It's like it's trying to think layers beyond layers beyond layers beyond layers, and it's one of those things where you got to sort of train your mind. It's like this sort of concept, and as we're growing up as kids, we don't really get shown or required to think of this sort of layering over layering over layering. So our brains aren't attuned to this type of thinking. With enough time, though, like as a kid, everyone's brain can actually learn these things. It just comes with time. It's a new way of thinking. Like, our brains are very dynamic. They're open to learning anything. That's what's the great thing about humans, is that we don't have a defined preset. We can be whatever we want to be. So just with time, this will eventually get there. So don't freak out. If you look at this and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm just going to quit now. Don't worry. Like, if I was to come back to this code tomorrow, or let's say a year from now, I'd be struggling to understand what's actually happening here. It's hard to see sort of what's going on. So don't freak out. It's more to just sort of show you that you can do this, and it is possible if you are required to do it. And you will probably come across this in very complex code. But yeah, just try and break it down. Start trying to think of how the first one is being destructured, then think of the next one's being destructured. And hopefully I'll be able to add something like this in the challenge set that I create for you. Okay, so that's pretty much all you really need to know when it comes to destructuring from objects. With all of that together, that gives you all the foundations you're going to need to be able to destructure from objects. I highly recommend trying to destructure as much as possible. Like, you need to get used to it. In the beginning, it's it's like you will be sort of like, what's going on, but I promise you, like, it's one of those things. Once you actually do get it, it's actually quite simple. The basics behind it. It's not like you have to do sort of these weird calculations to get to where you get. It's sort of very straightforward. I mean, it can get complex, like the examples that I showed you, but at the end of the day, it really is straightforward. It's just it's doing the same thing every single time. Okay, cool. So let's now start looking at arrays. So let's now have a look at destruction from arrays. The principles are exactly the same as objects. The only difference being really that the arrays are just a list of values that are separated with a comma, whereas objects, we've got key value pairs. Objects typically from destructuring is a little bit more complex than arrays, which is why I started with it. Arrays are going to be a lot more simpler. But there is sort of one key difference, and let's look at that. So the one main difference is that when we are trying to destructure from an array, we don't have key value pairs to actually use. So let's actually try this. Okay, so when we are destructuring from an array, we use square brackets. We don't use curly brackets, and then we'll do the coordinates. Now, when we looked at objects, we could go and see the values by pushing Control Spacebar. So I've pushed Control Spacebar, and we would see the key value pairs in those objects from that object. But because we don't have key value pairs, you're not going to see anything over here. So what it instead does when you destructure is it copies the order of how they appear in the array. So if I was to go and say index 0, index 1, index 2, and then console log these, save it, you're going to see that it corresponds with these three values: 43, 23, 94. So you can see that it's completely the same. So that's how it works when it comes to destructuring from arrays. When we destructure from objects, we use the key value pairs and they match, like the key matches with what's coming out the object. Whereas arrays, over here, as we're destructuring, the variables that we're giving or we're unpacking into our little box here, those are corresponding with the order that they appear in the array. Okay, so let's take it, let's start looking at some of the other features like we looked at earlier. Like, okay, so the first one we're going to look at is the rest operator. Sorry, the rest syntax. So like that last one, when we looked at the objects, we could do ... and we could say rest. It doesn't have to be rest. It could be, you can give any name you want. What's important is the ellipses, or the 3 dots. So let's go, and I'm just going to comment that out, and I want to console log rest. So now, give you a second if you can imagine what's actually going to happen here when I console log rest and save it. So you can see that it's getting 19, 34, 29. Okay, so what it's done is basically we've unpacked index 0, so it's sort of no longer there. It technically is. It's still going to actually be in coordinates, but while we're destructuring, technically index 0 is gone, index 1 is gone, and index 2 is gone. So these three are gone. So what is sort of remaining when we're destructuring? It's just these last values, and then we can go grab those. Okay, so if you can sort of like try and imagine the use cases for this, it's very rare like to try and actually where you will actually see destructuring of arrays taking place. Like I try and often do it, and I struggle to find opportunities to do it. Like when I actually do, I actually write on the internet like, "Well, check this out! I actually destructured an array." It's that's seldomly used. However, with that being said, in React you will actually see this, and it's fine if you don't know React. But I just thought that I will mention it. When people are, for example, you're using state in React, so you will go and say const set value. It's a const value and set value, and then you would go and set it to use state. Can you see that these are actually square brackets, right? And then we've got value and set value. That's because use state is actually returning an array with two values, and then we are giving or the two values that it returns is the value, this first one here, that is the state value. And then the other one is the function to set the state value. And that's why we can call this anything we want. We can call this blah, 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 and we can also call this blah, 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 blah. It doesn't matter. We've got that option. It's just as long as we know that this first one we're destructuring from the array that it's returning is the actual state value, and the second one that's returning is the function to set that state value. So this is where you actually will see it being used a lot. But, outside of React, in these cases where they've set it up that way, it is very seldom that you do actually use it like this. The times that I tend to find opportunities to use it is when I'm dealing with events from like on HTML events. That's where sometimes I've come across it and I've been able to actually use it. But compared to destructuring from objects, where you will always be using it, like it's like every page of code, like whenever I'm working, there's always destructuring objects. Whereas destructuring from arrays, like outside of React, like so sort of maybe once a month. No, actually, geez, a lot. It's more like on a yearly basis. Like very rarely in the year am I actually destructuring from an actual array. Outside of these sort of React cases. Now there's this additional feature here that you get with arrays that you don't get with objects. Let's just actually get rid of this and take that out. Okay, so there's additional feature that you get with arrays because it's using sort of a sequence of values instead of key values. Sorry, like a key to reference a key value pair, is that we can actually skip values. What if we actually wanted this 19 over here? So it's index 0, 1, 2, 3. So we actually wanted index 3. Now we would actually have to go and write out index 0, index 1, index 2, index 3, just to get this index 3. So now we could finally go and say console log index 3. But yeah, this is not so great. So what you can actually do is actually just delete these and just have commas. And what it's doing is basically skipping these variables. So we've got index 0, index 1, index 2, and then finally index 3. Okay, so now when I save it, my code format is going to add this in here because it's cleaner to read. But you can see that we've actually been able to skip these values. And then we get index 3. And then let's say we want to skip the second last one. So that's 34. And then lastly, it's going to be index 5. So let's also do index 5. And save it. So you can see we've got 19 at index 3 and 29 at index 5. And just keep in mind that when I'm writing index 3, these variable names don't mean anything. It can be anything you want. I'm just calling it index 3 so that it's easier for our minds to know what we are talking about in these examples. Okay, so yeah, so that's basically skipping values in when we're trying to destructure from an array. Right, so there's nothing really I can cover now. Nothing else I can really cover with arrays. Other than I didn't actually show you the one main example I wanted to do with this. And it's another place where I am actually usually able to do structures. And it's why I've actually called it coordinates. Is that sometimes you might have a list of coordinates. And it just seems so clean to do this. Where you've now got your x coordinate and you've got your y coordinate. And now I can console log x and y. Okay, so it's just sort of like a bonus. This is where like one of my favorite uses of it is that I sometimes have a list of coordinates, and I know the first one is the x, and I know the last one is the y. But it might even be like, let's say it's like a game or something, and this is your x, y, and z plane that it's stored as an array or tuple, and then basically I'm extracting it as I'm unpacking it as an x and a y, and I just really like this use case. It just works really well for me. Okay, right. So that is destructuring with arrays. Right. So that is destructuring. Apologize for the video not being as long as usual. Usually I try and make these videos about an hour long and maybe even go a little bit past that. But with destructuring, there isn't so much content. It really is just that simple where you just destructuring these values or unpacking them into your little box, and then you get to reuse those variables throughout your code. In the beginning, when you're looking at it now, if you're starting new in JavaScript, it will be intimidating. It does, like seasoned developers they forget how sort of these things can be intimidating. But I always try and remember how these things can be. And I know when I was like learning, when I looked at it, it was intimidating because you've actually got, it's backwards. You've now got your variable name on the right hand side, and then you've got your values on the left hand side, and then they're wrapped with these sort of like this weird syntax. And amongst like other complex code that you haven't been able to sort of mentally digest yet, you've now suddenly got this weird syntax, and it can be overwhelming. But when you actually break it away and you just look at destructuring on its own, it's a very, very basic principle. It makes your code clean, makes your code concise, and it just seems more natural, when you're dealing with objects. If you do find ways to destructure from an array, bonus points, like let me know. Like I'll have to give a shout out to you for being able to do it, because it's so rare that you actually do get to actually use it. Okay, great. Please let me know if there's anything I could do to improve these videos, or if there's something you just don't like. You can, send me a PM and say, hey man, that really sucked, that one thing you did. Please let me know. Like I just want to actually try and make these things better. These sessions, as mentioned at the beginning, are sponsored by Code Capsules. Like, do check them out, especially if you're a South African developer. Get your pages on there before when you actually want to demo your portfolio. Your page will load so fast. It will shine compared to your peers who've got their stuff on another provider in the United States or wherever, and it takes maybe a second to load. Whereas it's like an instant page load when you're hosting your stuff on Code Capsules. Be sure to check us out on the ZATech Slack server. You can come to the FEDSA mentoring channel there and ask any questions. Like every week, we've got senior devs that come and help us on a Friday where to ask questions, and they'll be able to help. You can ask any kind of questions, and it doesn't have to be in public. You can even PM us and ask us about job interviews or how to improve your portfolio, your LinkedIn profile, any of that stuff. You can come and ask us. And then lastly, something that I'm going to start trying to add with these videos are little sort of challenges, which are code on GitHub, where I'll be looking at the stuff that, it's questions based on the content that we've just covered to try and get you to learn about it, where I'll start with maybe some basic stuff and then try more advanced stuff. And it's fine if you can't get it. On GitHub, you will see that there will be sort of your questions branch, and there will also be a solutions branch so that you can also see what the answers are to the questions. Okay, great. So then I will see you next week, most likely with TypeScript. Have a great day, and see you then. Cheers.